All right. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. With me, as always, is Phil McKenzie, and both of us are almost entirely returned to the land of the living this week. Gotta be honest, Phil. I didn't love putting out last week's episode. I feel like I probably said some insane things. My brain was simply not functioning at full capacity. So I'm going to do my damnedest to do my strongest, most vivacious and full-throated analysis for this week's episode. And I expect that you, as per your usual method, will really phone it in.
Yeah, damn straight. I feel like I put in so much effort to overcome the demon bug last week that, I've now earned a rest, and I will let you do all the heavy lifting.
We'll now be taking 2020 off.
I will say that, I had friends who had the same bug, and they were apparently had just, like one of them was singing nursery rhymes, and another one was talking to people who weren't there. So, those who tuned into our episode last week, it could have been worse. That's all I'm saying.
It could have been worse. All right. Well, I mean, this week is easy. We won't be searching for a topic. It's very straightforward. Because UFC 246 is on the horizon, and Conor McGregor is making his comeback. Do we have to say long awaited? I don't know. I feel like most people in MMA are kind of over Conor McGregor at this point. I don't know. Is that just me projecting on the world of sport? It just kind of feels like there's not nearly as much buzz for a Conor McGregor return as there would have been, say, before his loss to Khabib Nurmagomedov.
I think that there's a combination of things going on there, right? That firstly, we are in the bubbliest bubble, the most hardcore and specific subsection of the fan base.
True.
And secondly, and that is a group which is notably prone to hating on whatever the flavor of the month is.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, just from both the hardcore and the wider perspective, this is the first fight that he's had for a very long time that doesn't have huge stakes associated with it. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of think pieces going up, if Conor McGregor loses this one, is he done? Does it affect his brand? All that kind of thing. But realistically, everything that he had was part of all his fights before this for a good long time were part of a narrative which this one doesn't really have.
Yeah. So I think that's it for me, is that we're sort of past the era of the ever ascending Conor McGregor. The always taking on some kind of new challenge or doing something never done before. It's now he's just another guy fighting Cowboy Cerrone, who's fought everyone. I think I'm not surprised, at least, for me, that it's lost some of that special appeal. I think it's also, though, that, listeners, you had to know this is coming. This is a profoundly cynical fight. You know what I mean? I don't want to spoil our analysis in this first segment. And we will be talking, by the way, about the rest of this card. There's quite a lot of other good stuff on this card. A couple highlights that stand out to me: Claudia Gadelha versus Alexa Grasso. I think that's a very interesting fight. I'm quite into Anthony Pettis versus Carlos Diego Ferreira, who looked phenomenal in his last fight. We've got Andre Fili versus Sadiq Yussuf. Macy Barber is taking on Roxanne Modafferi, which makes me very sad, but is also a meaningful, relevant fight. There's some good stuff on here, so we'll be getting to that later in the episode. But the thing that I can't get over is that this main event is so cynically put together. Everyone is expecting Conor McGregor to win, and for good reason. This is not the first time the topic of this potential matchup has been broached, and people like you and me, Phil, people like all the scooting vapors online, anyone who has any pretense at calling themselves a fight analyst has been talking about this matchup as a possibility for years, always knowing that we would be picking Conor McGregor. It's like it is the poison pill matchup for Donald Cerrone based on all of his historical weaknesses. And the UFC knows that. So, like, it's really annoyed me that, like, Dana White has had the fucking gall to go around saying, ooh, people are disrespecting Cowboy Cerrone by counting him out in this fight, as if that's not exactly the reason they made this matchup. Because they are trying to get one last Conor McGregor cash-in, vault him into one last undeserved title shot or whatever. And the best way to do that is to get a relatively high reward, low risk name victory. And Cowboy Cerrone is like tailor made to be that guy. Is that more or less how you see it? Oh God. I was so correct.
Sorry. I was on mute for a second there.
I was so correct that Phil vanished.
Just in case I had a coughing fit.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, I would say that all of those things are valid, but I don't really mind the matchup. I think everyone involved is happy with it, and that's okay for me. Like, the Donald Cerrone obviously has wanted this matchup for a long time. It's his chance to get a big sort of career-defining payday out of it, and his chance to spring a huge upset. And if he gets brutally knocked out, well, then it hasn't been the first, second, third, or fourth time. And you know, Conor, as we said, Conor McGregor wants a like a relatively softball fight on his way back, and to be honest, like, despite the fact that this is almost entirely his own fault for keeping a very slow schedule, he has had a very, you know, every fight he has had has been incredibly hard since he fought, like, Chad Mendes.
Yeah. So he still hasn't done the hardest thing in MMA, which is defending a title. Yeah.
But, like, in terms of him getting softball matchups, yeah, I mean, it's happening. But, you know, I mean, but the other contention, you know, the other person who would be, you know, they're going to presumably try and leverage they're going to try and leverage McGregor into a title shot, possibly, if he wins this. But the other person who's up for that is
Masvidal?
Justin Gaethje.
Oh, Gaethje.
Yeah, I mean, Gaethje at if we're talking lightweight. And his wins are over James Vick, Edson Barboza, and Donald Cerrone. So if we're talking like people who have been given favorable matchups on the road to a title,
sure.
You know, it's hard to level too much hypocrisy at Conor.
Yeah, I think it's also against the backdrop of everything that's going on for Conor McGregor outside the cage. Also adds to the feeling of cynicism for me. Like, the man is, I believe, still under 2 investigations for allegations of sexual assault. And has just been like a complete shithead in public for the last year. So it also feels like, the first, like, forgiving matchup of Conor McGregor's career comes at a very convenient time for PR purposes. But let's talk about the matchup itself. Like, I can't just go on and lambast it for saying how cynically it's made, without laying out the reasons that it is, I think we both agree, a forgiving matchup for Conor McGregor. Like I said, it is the poison matchup for Donald Cerrone. If we were to list all of the, like, problems that Cerrone has struggled with in the past, of course, as you hinted before, I think, if he were to lose this fight if he were to be knocked out here, I think it would be his 7th knockout loss of a 50-fight MMA career. So power punchers, obviously a thing that Donald Cerrone has not always fared that well against. Southpaws, check. Body punchers / body kickers, check. Aggressive pressure fighters, check. And especially fast starters. And you and I have noted several times, Conor McGregor may still be the best, fastest starter in the sport. Someone who is ready to go with his 2 or 3 specialty triggers from the moment the fight begins, as our beloved boy Jose Aldo sadly learned. So that's like 4 or 5 qualities that Cerrone has historically struggled with that I think that, at least if, assuming McGregor is anything like his old self, he basically embodies. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, that's pretty much the shape of it.
The big question is like, how does Conor McGregor look? This is at 170, which is a strange thing. Conor McGregor has been looking very, very muscular. So one might even say bulbous in his lead-up photos leading up to the fight. And I think we all recall the last time that he came in surprisingly heavy against Nate Diaz, he had his most catastrophic cardio failure that we've ever seen. And he's always been a guy, I think, who stamina has been like one of the Achilles heels. So how does this play out, basically, if he can't finish Donald Cerrone early, which I think is the result most are expecting?
Yeah, so I think the welterweight dynamic has 2 factors to it. Yeah, I mean, firstly, the one is obviously the McGregor factor, as you mentioned. I think it is sort of bitterly ironic that I think McGregor's greatest, best wins and best performances largely came at featherweight or against people that were smaller than him, because he is such a marvelously accurate puncher, and he is, he works so well with a reach advantage, and it's been kind of weird that, his issues are typically, when he comes up against things like, amongst other things, size parity and people who can just physically overpower him and gassing out and so on, that his solution, as his career has gone on, a solution has been to go up to welterweight, whereas Jose Aldo, who has had bulletproof wrestling, and relies heavily on a speed advantage and so on, has gone down to bantamweight. So it's been bizarre that they've taken these career trajectories. But yeah, the other thing apart from McGregor at welterweight is Cerrone at welterweight, because the main thing he obviously has to do, and everyone knows it, is he has to survive 2 rounds. And can he survive? Is he more likely to be able to survive 2 rounds if he's up at welterweight? And I think the answer is definitely yes. I would be extremely confident that he would get knocked out in 1 round at welterweight. At lightweight. And I'm, spoiler warning, only somewhat confident that he will get knocked out in 1 round at welterweight.
Yeah, he has mostly looked very good at welterweight, right? Like, it's a division where I think he's looked more durable. What were his welterweight losses?
They were Leon Edwards in a decision. They were Darren Till, who just overpowered him. They were Lawler in another decision, notably, and Jorge Masvidal, who did admittedly knock him out twice.
Oh yeah, that one was at welterweight too, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe not more durable at welterweight. Why do you expect him? Why would you be less expecting of a knockout at 170 then?
I think he still has been more durable. I mean, Robbie Lawler is, regardless of anything else, a big hitter.
True.
And Leon Edwards has also, he hasn't done it as much of late, but he is still a large, powerful puncher. And a southpaw. Like, remember him one punch killing poor, who was it? Seth Baczynski?
Boy, do I.
Yeah. So I definitely think he can take shots better at this weight class.
Okay.
And the Masvidal fight, he took a beating before he went down.
Yeah, it's true. He was finished with a barrage, including body shots and everything. Even though he was like 100% knocked out at the end of the first round in that fight. Okay, so there's that. There's the being higher in weight. I also think that Cerrone has looked quite physically strong and quick at 170. You know, he's looked very comfortable at 170, so much so that I still kind of wish he had just stayed there. But this is MMA where, like, if you lose, you have to make some kind of large dramatic change to, like, trick yourself into thinking that now you're not going to lose anymore, even if that change has nothing to do with the factors that were leading you to lose. The main thing for me is how much slower might Conor McGregor look at 170? Like, to me, the big advantage is, you know, we saw Cerrone against Iaquinta at lightweight. He looked pretty phenomenal. In what was, I think, a very forgiving matchup for him. But he looked really comfortable at 155. I don't think he really fluctuates that much from one weight to the other as much as I think Conor McGregor might. Does that make sense? Like,
I think so. But, you know, if we're thinking about how they've performed in their relative fights at these weight classes, it's worth noting that, like, McGregor dropped Nate Diaz multiple times in the first round of their rematch after pushing him directly up against the cage. And Nate Diaz is both more durable and considerably harder to push up against the fence than Cerrone is. And McGregor did it relatively effortlessly. But that being said, like, I think, you know, we've talked before about how Cerrone's trip at up to welterweight did actually allow him to round out his game more. I think he's definitely become a better boxer because he was compelled to be. He had to he couldn't just strand people out at kicking range and knee them when they came jumping in. He literally just had to exchange punches with people. And we saw that then he was able to develop a bit more in the way of slipping, throwing the left hook, jabbing, and being able to fight in extended punching exchanges without just doing his thing of holding his head bolt up in the air and just punching 1-2 over and over as he tended to do back in the day. So I think it also helped him out with his ability to like utilize his wrestling, because when he was fighting people who were closer to his own height, he was able to level change and hit takedowns on them. So one of the questions for this fight is, does he fight McGregor like a lightweight or a welterweight? Because McGregor is shorter than him, but you know, both elements of both of those games seem like they would be preferential for Cerrone. On the one hand, he does want to kick McGregor and keep him at range and not get him into any punching exchanges with him. But on the other, he also wants to hit level change and hit takedowns because he's not going to be surviving an extended stand-up war in the pocket with him.
Yeah, the thing is he has said that he's not going to go for takedowns. Cerrone, he usually does, but I also think Cerrone might be like one of the few guys who is like dumb enough to take that challenge from McGregor. You know what I mean? Like, I think he might actually feel that there's some kind of gentleman's agreement where he's not going to go for takedowns. It would be foolish. Like, obviously, if you're Cerrone, that's a great way to try and invest in surviving the early going. Is keep McGregor at kicking range. As much as possible, lots and lots of front kicks, lots of high kicks to keep his hands chambered in a defensive position. And then when he charges up to come in and close you down, you take him off his feet. But I don't know if you will. I'm not sure how much I trust Cerrone. He is definitely a dude's rock type of person, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he himself really knows what he's going to do until he's in there a lot of the time.
Yeah, I agree.
But I will say that, like, it hasn't particularly been a great way of getting to McGregor to throw counter takedowns at him, because he's a pretty good pressure fighter with regards to his footwork. Like, he's not someone who tends to overcommit on the way in. So a lot of his counter takedowns have been the classic blast double to someone who is really like lunging in, and McGregor doesn't really do that a lot. He does occasionally, but only when he's sure that the other person is out of position.
Yeah, you're right.
What was the other thing I was going to say? Yeah, but it is worth noting. Someone pointed this out on Twitter, and I'm sorry for not crediting you, but I can't remember. Like, McGregor has been pretty good at fighting shorter people in general. He's, I think, something like 16-1 against people who are shorter than him. I think with the lone loss being RDA.
Mm-hmm. Well, McGregor didn't fight RDA.
No.
Cerrone, you mean? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but yeah, I think McGregor is, apart from anything else, he's someone with, he might be only 5'9", but he has, like RDA, he has pretty long arms for his build.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't think we get a kind of performance where we won't get anything like an Alex Hernandez performance where he has to like jump into range. I think he's going to happily just edge his way into range, and he might take a few kicks to do so.
Well, and certainly if it's anything like the Hernandez fight where the fighters like clash and then Cerrone ends up winning because he's the more willing to extend the exchanges and follow his opponent back out of the pocket, that is a very risky tack to follow against Conor McGregor. Who will take your head off as you try to pursue him with your like reckless lunging shift combination. So, I mean, we're basically just like exploring all of the ideas, all of these other options in a matchup that we both came into this episode knowing very confidently we would pick Conor McGregor and most likely to get an early finish. And lo and behold, that is my pick. I think Conor McGregor is going to knock Donald Cerrone out quite probably in the first round.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the one.
There's the main event of UFC 246. We know why the fight is being made, and it is being made because it's a pretty easy one to call. It's going to be really interesting if that doesn't happen, but I just don't know how much time it's worth investing in what might how rounds 3, 4, and 5 might shake out if we're really most likely just to see 1 or 2. Okay. Let's take a break. When we come back, as I said before, the rest of this card is maybe the more interesting portion of it, the undercard. We have Holly Holm versus Raquel Pennington 2 in the co-main event. Not sure that's going to be a thrilling fight if the first one is any indication, but certainly one worth talking about. Another really great women's fight on the main card here, Claudia Gadelha versus Alexa Grasso, and the main card opener, Anthony Pettis versus Carlos Diego Ferreira, and there is lots more on the undercard, the prelims as well. So we will get to that and more after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
All right. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. We now move on through the less predictable portion of the card. Claudia Gadelha versus Alexa Grasso. Grasso finally turned that corner we were waiting for her to turn in her fight with Karolina Kowalkiewicz. She looked absolutely phenomenal. And in her last fight with Carla Esparza, one that a lot of people thought she won. I had no problem with it going to Esparza. It was that kind of fight. But it was thrilling and possibly an interesting predictor of what we might expect to see here. Against a Claudia Gadelha, who has also maybe turned a kind of corner. In her last fight with Ronda Marcos, she looked maybe a little more confident and more like assured, more like she knew what she should be doing. That being said, what she ended up doing was exactly the kind of striking performance that actually found her success way earlier in her career. So you could call it a progression. You could also call it like a reversion back to an earlier version of Claudia Gadelha, maybe not the worst thing in the world, because before Gadelha started to have all of her well-known self-destructive problems, she was, of course, like, you know, the number 2 strawweight in the UFC and that anyone knew of. So yeah, interesting matchup. You want to give me the basic rundown in your eye, Phil?
Yeah, so I think the basic nature of this one has to be, can Gadelha hit takedowns on Alexa Grasso, and if so, what happens after that? Because, yeah, we saw pretty much a kind of Tyron Woodley type performance out of Claudia Gadelha last time, where she was able to fight a very conservative power-punching, counter-punching fight against Randa Marcos, who came out with a game plan which I am frankly appalled that we forgot to include in the handies as one of the very worst of the year, in that she just seemed to come out and fight Claudia Gadelha and think, you know what, I'm going to fight Claudia Gadelha and give her exactly the pace she wants.
It being Randa Marcos, hard to even describe it as a game plan, though.
Yeah,
it was just sort of
true.
The thing that happened in the fight. I don't know if that was a strategy. Not really how she fights.
Very true. So yeah, I think Gadelha has always been a good counterpuncher with some caveats. She's not a mechanically beautiful puncher. She tends to kind of completely disengage her hips and just sort of row with her punches. She kind of leans over and throws them.
Real John Vellante punching mechanics.
Yeah. But she's extremely explosive and has tons of physical strength, and has like good natural timing. And that all works really well for her. And
she was really putting combinations together on the counter against Marcos. Like, a lot of them were sort of uninspired meat and potatoes combinations, but also we had some, like, a lot of left hooks playing off of uppercuts, a lot of uppercuts following straights. Like, there were a couple of 3 and 4 shot combos where the first couple shots were not effective and the last 1 or 2 were. So, you know, it's something.
Yep. And so the question for Grasso is, can she fight at a higher pace than Marcos? And I think the answer is almost certainly yes. We have seen people drop Grasso's pace, but not to, never to anything like the the relatively slow pace that we saw Gadelha have with Marcos. And so I think she can definitely keep the pace higher than the one that Gadelha wants to fight it at. But the problem is, can she do that without taking counter takedowns? Because that was what lost her the Esparza fight, much as I didn't really think she lost that fight at all. She did get taken down a bunch, and Gadelha, for all her, flaws on the feet, is one of the 2 or 3 most dangerous women to have on top of you in this division.
Yeah, that's the big thing. How much do you trust Gadelha to go for takedowns? Because she didn't go for much. Any against Randa Marcos. Now, maybe that was a good idea. That would have allowed the pace to sort of spiral. In fact, I tend to think maybe it was, because Randa Marcos is very reactive, counter-oriented sort of fighter. She allows her opponent to dictate what kind of exchange is going to happen and what pace it's going to be fought at. But once you kind of trigger her into an exchange, she can be really, really explosive and relentless. And I think that is, she's just way more fluid, like a lot of MMA fighters, when that exchange is a grappling scramble and not an exchange of punches. Where she's flinching and over-reliant on one hand and just sort of guessing most of the time. So maybe that was the right idea, that the pace would have spiraled out of Gadelha's comfort zone if she had forced grappling exchanges. That's not necessarily untrue against Grasso either, though. We've seen some performances where Grasso is just taken down and doesn't do much. But if we're expecting her to be moving forward based on what we saw in that in the Esparza fight. That was a very, very active ground performance from her. Super aggressive from her back. Basically every time that Esparza got her down. Using her legs really actively to create space. Framing off with her hands and landing strikes from her back. Constantly attacking submissions. Now, maybe these things are much riskier with Gadelha on top of her, but also, like, can Gadelha afford to fight even one really hard round without it significantly affecting the rest of the fight for her? And I tend to think not.
Yeah, I mean, it is. There's one other thing worth noting, and that is the physicality disparity.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if you look at Gadelha's losses, they tend to be to women with a physical edge over her in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Jędrzejczyk and Ansarov are both simply like enormous.
Mm-hmm.
They're just very big for strawweight.
Particularly very rangy. They have long ass limbs.
Yeah, they're just big and tall. And Gadelha was constantly having to blitz in against them. And Andrade is obviously, she's Andrade. She's a tiny Hulk person.
Mm-hmm.
And Grasso is not a physical force.
No.
And so it's worth thinking, like, this could be something like either the Kovalkiewicz or the Kovalkiewicz fight for Gadelha or the Felice Herrig fight for Grasso, where Grasso is simply like Gadelha can just hit a counter takedown almost immediately off of her forward movement, and B, like, she may not be able to tire Gadelha out as much as like other fighters could, because she's simply not as physically powerful as them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Felice Herrig fight of Grasso's, I agree. I think it's the most relevant. Basically, like, what decided that fight was very much like what Gadelha successfully did to Ronda Marcos, where she just kind of sat back at a long range, tried to make Grasso bridge that distance. I might have said that would be a bad idea against Grasso otherwise, except for how she fought that Esparza fight was like very front foot heavy, very crouched. Like she fought like a striker who was really wary of the takedown, and it kind of destroyed her ability to easily cover the distance with her own strikes. Like, having all that weight in her front foot, she had to like reach and fall off balance in order to get her jab to connect a lot of the time. Made it harder for her to throw smooth combinations the way that she did against Kovalkiewicz. And as long as Gadelha has her worried about the takedown, I assume similar problems in this one. So if we have a Grasso who's like somewhat compromised closing the distance against a Gadelha who is perfectly content to just wing big counter combinations and hit the occasional reactive shot, I think the physicality is just the big factor. And maybe we'll see, like, maybe this is the kind of fight that Grasso in another year or two could win if she continues to, become more physically imposing. But for now, I think I lean Gadelha. The dynamics of that Herrig matchup for Grasso are pretty much there. The slow, patient countering approach, plus an even more physical opponent than Felice Herrig.
Yeah, the other one to note is obviously Tatiana Suarez.
Right.
Who just instantly polished Grasso off.
Yeah, and it wasn't... Carla Esparza, we talk about all the time. Like, if she were more physically imposing, she'd be like top notch, consistently top 2 or 3 contender in this division. She's that quality of a fighter, and yet she's tiny. She's really, really diminutive. She still managed to get Grasso down almost whenever she wanted, until about like 8 or 9 minutes into that fight when she started to gas. and Grasso started to hurt her. And even then, she still got Grasso down again in the third round. Grasso's like takedown defense is just not that incredible, and she's not physical enough to make up for it. So, Gadelha?
Yeah, I might change my pick if it were 5 rounds, but it's not.
Yeah, same. Grasso, yeah, I don't know. I think it still could be very interesting. Like, Grasso's just sheer scrappiness might make a difference. But, like when Gadelha fought Esparza was very scrappy, and it just wasn't quite enough, to really like pull away. Okay, well, that's a really fascinating fight. Can't wait to see it. I still think I'm not as confident in that one as I am in the main event. So I think that one is still very much worth watching to find out what the hell's going to happen. Let's take another break though, because when we come back, we get to discuss Anthony Pettis versus Carlos Diego Ferreira, who, as I said, had a phenomenal pressure fighting performance, absolutely dominating Mairbek Taisumov in his last fight. No one saw that coming. Also a recent convert to our favorite camp, Fortis MMA, which had a lot to do, I think, with that performance. And we're also going to talk about, a couple other things. Andre Fili versus Sadiq Yussuf, Drew Dober versus Nasrat Haqparast, Roxanne Modafferi versus Macy Barber. Solid undercard here after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
Okay, welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's talk about this main card opener. Anthony Pettis, Carlos Diego Ferreira. Phil, you want to take it away on this one?
Yeah, sure. So this is another one sort of similar to the main event, where I think it's a nightmare matchup for the long-running and reasonably well-beloved lightweight action fighter. We saw Carlos Diego Ferreira chasing down a very dynamic kickboxer in his last fight, throwing out one of our favorite performances of the year, which we should have had. I think one of the themes of this episode is going to be remembering people we should have shouted out in the handies.
Shut up, Phil. You're going to make people think that was some sort of slapdash operation.
Perish the thought. But yeah, one of my favorite performances from last year was that pressure performance over Mairbek Taisumov. And that's been something which I don't think Anthony Pettis has ever shown that he can deal with, unless he's able to like convert the forward pressure into either a big punch, which I think was our secret thing that we always shouted out about Anthony Pettis, which only really like reared its head in the
Wonder Boy fight. Yeah. Yep.
He was actually a pretty big puncher, and or he can hit he can get into a scramble situation in his submission. But Carlos Diego Ferreira is a really, really good grappler.
Yes, he is.
And yeah, he's just shown an ability to like feint, change levels, mix up his timing, like throw multiple strikes in a combination, get back out again safely. I mean, he absolutely wrecked Taisumov's triggers, who is a much better counterfighter than Anthony Pettis is. Like, he's a much better counterpuncher than Anthony Pettis.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, and he got to Carlos Diego Ferreira as well. I mean, if there's one thing which has defined Ferreira in his UFC career, it has often been just complete fearlessness.
Yeah,
and that's not necessarily always the best thing, but I think it serves him very well in this fight.
Yeah, I mean, he leveraged that. I agree. Like, he's always been 100% down to brawl. and earlier in his UFC career was just a brawler. Like, that's pretty much for most of his UFC career. In fact, Carlos Diego Ferreira has just, like, if he has beaten someone striking, it has been simply because he's willing to throw longer and more combinations, to exchange more recklessly than them. And, yeah, he, like, finally against Mirbek Taisimov leveraged that fearlessness into a really intelligent process that made lots of sense, which was relentless pressure and aggressive counterpunching from range. And it was the from range that really stood out because that was a jabbing feast against Mirbek Taisimov. That was like death by a million jabs. That was the weapon that totally screwed up Taisimov's ability to read counters, is that Ferreira was really, really aggressive with his jab, by which I do not mean he threw it really hard. In fact, like, the main thing that made it so effective was that he took basically all the steam off of it. It was very much the kind of jabbing that we used to see out of, like, new converts to Dwayne Ludwig's style. Dwayne Ludwig has always been really big on the, touch, pow kind of striking. The pet slap, as I once had it explained to me. If you have a cat on your lap, it's never going to see a slap coming if you pet it twice first. And that was
as you were clearly taught by taught by psychopaths.
that was the approach from Carlos Diego Ferreira. Is he contented himself with just being able to touch Taisimov with the jab. That's what the jab is for. And then that not only destroyed Taisimov's ability to like get comfortable and see things coming, because there was constantly just this annoying buzzing jab in his face, but it made it really difficult for him to time counters, because Carlos Diego Ferreira was constantly receiving information on range and timing and movement, and was then able to make educated decisions as to when to actually sit down on his own power shots. And then he feinted that a lot too. So adding even more confusion to what Taisimov was going through. All of this with just absolutely relentless pressure. Again, that fearlessness. Like, he did get buzzed and hurt by Taisimov a couple times in that fight and just didn't blink. Like, went right back to what his coaches had prepared him to do. Stuck to a game plan beautifully. And yeah, like, remember Anthony Pettis' fight with Rafael dos Anjos? Like, endless, relentless pressure. Lots and lots of output. A know-how of how to touch an opponent and corral them into big shots. Like, that just sounds like a nightmare for Anthony Pettis. I think I agree with you. Like, pretty straightforward call. That unless Anthony Pettis just puts Carlos Diego Ferreira out, or, I mean, I really think it's unlikely that he's going to catch him in a fucking submission from guard. So, like, I think he's just getting beaten up in this fight. I think it's a really rough matchup for him.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen Tony Ferguson, we've seen Nate Diaz in a particularly ugly performance. Like, even like people like Nate Diaz is not a particularly competent pressure fighter, but when he just stuck to it, Pettis just could not keep with him. And yeah, I would like Carlos Diego Ferreira. He's done so well lately, and I'm glad that he's getting this is one of those things where it's another forgiving matchup, but I'm honestly kind of glad that he's getting it, because he deserves to get a showcase. Right.
Yeah, that's what this is. It's a low risk, high reward matchup for Carlos Diego Ferreira. Not the most low risk, as we said. Anthony Pettis, a huge puncher, accurate, quick, and still, in his way, insanely durable. But
yeah, and I said it before, like, after the performance, after his Taisimov fight, and I think Callan on Twitter, Callan Gadelha, said that like one of the things about Khabib is that everyone just seems to have fought him wrong, and I will say Carlos Diego Ferreira is someone who is never going to get a shot at Khabib Nurmagomedov, but I think he is one of those guys that could actually give him some serious trouble.
Yeah, he would fight him right.
He does not give eighth. He doesn't overcommit, and he doesn't give a fuck. And you normally don't get those two things in combination.
Yeah, that's what you need is like an RDA, like someone who's just like tough and like is just like a fighter, but is also just kind of like a boring dude. You know, like you just tell him what to do, and he just goes in there and like eyes half open does it.
Yeah, it's too unimaginative to be scared.
Right. Yeah,
and that's awesome.
Yeah. So go Carlos Diego Ferreira. It feels predictable, but it is undoubtedly going to be very fun to watch. Anthony Pettis, always a great foil for his worst style matchups. And Carlos Diego Ferreira basically never disappoints. Like he even had a fun fight with Rustam Khabilov. So that's going to be fire. All right, let's continue moving down. Reverse chronological order through the preliminary card now. I'm not sure, again, how much breakdown needs to go into this one, but Roxanne Modafferi versus Macy Barber. This really does feel like a matchup where physicality is going to be the deciding factor, like a more dramatic version of Barber's fight with J.J. Aldrich, where she was like really badly losing it, and then just sort of like, you know, made a couple intelligent adjustments, but mostly was allowed to make those adjustments because of her physicality and was then able to leverage those into a sudden win because of a physical advantage. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Modafferi's already had one sort of miracle physicality win in the UFC over Shevchenko.
Mm-hmm.
But Shevchenko was more willing to concede a point scoring match against her. And that's the thing we've seen against Barber. She's extremely competitive and does not like losing at all. So I think she's probably going to come out and try and be technical. And if she starts losing, exchanges with Modafferi, she's just going to go berserk in a way that Anthony Shevchenko did not. And that's pretty much the end of that. I don't really see how Modafferi can really stand up to it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's actually quite likely that she will start to lose exchanges too. Like that flip is that switch is gonna have to be flipped at some point, because Roxanne has really shown a lot of growth as a striker, just in general as like a process-driven MMA fighter. Like she goes in there, she keeps a nice high guard, she moves laterally after she throws, and she leads behind her jab, like a lot of very good basic fundamental developments for her in the last few years. But yeah, I just don't see her being, I don't see Barber being willing to lose a decision the way that Antonina Shevchenko was. You know, she's not a Shevchenko sister. So like, she's not just going to have a boring, dull fight. She's going to go out and like the thing with, again, I want to emphasize the thing with J.J. Aldrich. It was like, there was a level of intelligent adjustment. There was a level of intellectual victory there for her. She didn't just suddenly start exchanging. She started to actually like make some reads and throw counters. It was a nice mixed bag for Barber between like, having to have the mental wherewithal to make that adjustment. But also like just needing the fucking guts to do it really, really hard. Those two things together, I just don't think. Bad combo for Roxanne. Okay, featherweights. Andre Fili versus Sadiq Yussuf. You and I discussed this one before we began recording and didn't have an altogether easy time coming to a conclusion. It's a little difficult to tell where Sadiq Yussuf is right now. Andre Fili has had two of the best wins of his career, I think. That last one over Shamo Moraes was really impressive. I thought a really strong, patient performance against over Miles Jury before that. Not sure how much either of those guys reflect what he can expect to get from Sadiq Yussuf, but Yussuf's last two fights have also kind of been ones that he was losing until he won them. As you pointed out, you know, Shamo Moraes, that's a fight he was well on his way. I mean, very close and competitive throughout, and a performance we were really impressed by. But certainly one he would have lost if not for the perfectly timed counter he hurt Moraes with in the latter half of round 3. Likewise, he was badly hurt twice by Gabriel Benitez, by Mowgli Benitez in their like 1-round war, and pretty much just caught Benitez getting overexcited with a counter and knocked him out with one shot, but was not necessarily winning that fight up to that point. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on Sodiq Yussuf and this matchup?
Yeah, it's really hard to come up with appropriate analogs, even though these two guys have fought people that aren't incredibly dissimilar to each other. It's a very weird dynamic. Like you said, Yussuf hasn't been winning those fights, but he has won them. And I think some of the ways of thinking, I mean, I'm not going to I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I think this is probably the hardest fight to call on the card, and but also like one of the most interesting ones to think about, because I think that we've seen both guys fighting against type. I think Yussuf has often been someone who likes a slow pace and has been forcing himself into kind of more aggressive performances where he's drawn out the counters that he needs to get to win, and that has gotten him into trouble. Whereas Fili is someone who I think really works at his best when he's up against relatively slow-paced, and I mean slow-paced both in terms of like punch count, but also just like their feet, fighters where he can really set up the angles he wants to come in on. You know, he can play with whether his left hand is going to be the jab or the cross, and he can set up his head kick and his body kick. I mean, he really wants to be able to kind of use... I mean, they genuinely are somewhat, you know, Cruz-esque entries when he's coming in. He's just, but he is, to his credit, a more, I think, effective lead hand fighter than Cruz is. But you know, when he's been forced into a defensive outfighting performance, despite the fact that, you know, you would think that sort of movement heavy, jab heavy style would work very well. Fili has not really looked all that great. He tends to get a little repetitive. He tends to overcommit, and like, you know, he'll do that. He tends to overcommit to kind of big defensive moves where he'll throw a dipping jab and then immediately just scuttle out to the side after doing it, which has left him open generally to kicks. But you know, it's not subtle defensive movements that he's using on defense. But conversely, when he has been pressuring for Yussuf, when he's been pressuring, he's been kind of getting himself into trouble. Like you said against Benitez, he really wasn't sure how to line up his feet on Benitez when Benitez was circling, and it ended up like he just walked straight into the line of fire for Benitez's straight left like a couple of times.
Yeah, he's not really like he doesn't use his jab an awful lot while pressuring. Strong contrast just watching Carlos Diego Ferreira's pressure performance in Yussuf's last two fights. Like, he does a lot of just sort of reaching out to sort of block or trap the opponent's hands and just trying to walk into range, and then throw like big hooking counters when they're forced to throw to fight him off. Yeah, but against Benitez, who really specializes in throwing crisp, straight, quick counter shots, that didn't work great for him. He got him tagged hard and hurt on several occasions. It's tough because Yussuf, those are not really characteristic performances for him, I don't think, based on a lot of what we saw before the UFC. But it's hard to know what is Yussuf's core style, because he's still really young, both in terms of age and just how long he's been at this. I don't know that he's like decided what kind of fighter he's going to be, but of course on his Contender Series fight, he was doing like the Tyron Woodley, you know, like backing himself into the cage. He does seem really, really strong as a counterpuncher. I think that's absolutely a style that would see him lose to Andre Fili. But on the other hand, these two performances that we're not 100% impressed or reassured by, you could argue are him fighting effectively against type. Two opponents he knew he needed to pressure. Because likewise, if he had just sat back at range against Gabriel Benitez, that's probably a bad idea too, right? Like, Benitez is a dynamite kicker. He's got great straight punches, really quick hands. And I think he had a bit of a reach advantage. Fili is going to have a 5-inch reach advantage here. So, like, did it just make sense for him to not look his best, not do what he's maybe most naturally comfortable doing to win those fights? I would kind of argue yes. And that would make just as much sense to keep the pressure on Andre Fili here. I think however more comfortable Yussuf might be on his back foot, it would not be a good idea to just let Fili have jabbing and kicking distance and time to use that. You know, I think lately we've seen particularly good lead hand work out of Andre Fili. It was really instrumental in beating Shema Moraes. He's just become way more confident and consistent with putting his jab out there and then drawing out counter opportunities with it too. So I don't know. It's a tough one. It's Yussuf maybe looking worse by doing the smarter thing or doing the natural thing and fighting a fight that Fili has actually confidently won a few times in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think Yussuf he's looking like the coming man. He has the prettier record and the big knockouts. He's obviously improving a lot from fight to fight. I think he's probably a pretty solidly sensible pick to make. I think I am going to pick Fili. I think to win this fight, Yussuf has to show another level of coachability. And he's shown that before, as you mentioned, he's been fighting against type. Because I think a good analog for how Yussuf needs to approach this fight was actually Dennis Bermudez. He needs to be a more skilled Dennis Bermudez. And he hasn't really shown exactly the elements of that. He hasn't really shown, like, the elements that even like Bermudez used in that performance, even though he's obviously a much better striker than Dennis Bermudez. A lot of what Dennis Bermudez did was just like using the jab to force Fili to exit exchanges because he didn't want to be in there with a big puncher, and then kicking him in the leg. And as you mentioned, like, Yussuf hasn't really been either a devoted leg kicker or like much of a lead hand jabber. Mm-hmm. So. And
that's a good point. Like, you're saying he needs to be more willing to content himself with just like getting the second or third favorite shot off, like he wants the one perfect counter punch in his exchanges. And those perfect counters have really been what's like saved him in recent fights, but he hasn't shown a tendency to just, he's never been satisfied to just end the combo with the low kick and be like, okay, that was a small success. I think
he's a big like kill shot guy. Yeah. Like both him and Fili like really like stuff like hand traps into head kicks, like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Like secondly, like Fili, his one of his best performances was against Miles Jury, who, if nothing else, is a very crafty counterpuncher, and Fili both like beat him like. He beat him, but not only did he beat him, but he started to whoop his ass as the fight went on. Mm-hmm. And because I think he is kind of I can overload counterpunches kind of guy. He's someone who's tended to, when he's tended to be winning, has often tended to.
Oh God! Both you and your connection were having a bout of the flu there. When he's tended to be winning, he what now?
He's tended to snowball his wins.
Yeah.
And he also has a very good chin. He's only been knocked out once, and that was by whatever that lunacy that Rodriguez threw at him. And he's still got counter takedowns in his back pocket, which I'm not sure that Yussuf is going to be able to withstand. And yeah, like I said, so if he's able to snowball his wins, if he's good against he's specifically been shown to be good against counter punches. And if Yussuf has sort of relied on turning fights around with single big counter punches, I think I'm gonna pick Fili.
Yeah, I still don't know. You make a good case. I mean, I think that there's definitely something to be said for like Fili's just a lot more satisfied with those small, meaningful shots that build over the course of a fight. Yussuf may kind of allow an opponent to, he doesn't do a lot of attritional damage. Like even against Shamo Moraes, it was pace that did the work there. Moraes has a tendency to flag over the course of a hard fight. He's like Gadelha, has like a fairly low threshold for where he's really comfortable. And Fili doesn't have that problem. On the other hand, like, I've never been in love with Fili's defensive reactions. He, as you said before, like really big, broad movements. He can kind of get baited into slipping into things or throwing himself out of position to respond with a punch, Edson Barboza style. And I don't think he responds that well to pressure. I think you're right. Like Fili is remarkably good at fighting counterpunchers. He's got a great jab. He has a real knack for like building an attack against a passive or reactive opponent, but when put into that role himself, just doesn't respond well to like really dynamic, varied attacks. And Yussuf is a great athlete. He can cover distance really quickly. He can throw a big, crazy-ass looping shot that connects from a range you don't think it's going to connect from. So I don't know. I think if what we saw from Yussuf in these last two fights is any indication of his direction going forward, then yeah, it may not be him at his best, but it certainly puts him in a position to land those kill shots he wants to land. But yeah, you're right. Fili's got the jab. He's got the excellent kicking game for as long as this stays at range, and he's got the reactive takedowns in his back pocket as well. He's a really underrated wrestler. I think I'm going to take.
I mean, yeah, it's like I said, it's worth pointing out he had an almost entirely kickboxing-based match with Dennis Bermudez, and in the eyes of many people, lost it. So,
yeah,
there's certainly like there's certainly a reasonable chance he just gets overpowered.
Yeah, but the other weird thing is like if he did win that fight, then it was his own takedown success that was responsible because he took Dennis Bermudez down several times, which is also impressive in its own way. I don't know. I think I'll take Yussuf. I think the dynamic athletic ability gives him a sort of edge if he does choose to play this in the same aggressive way he played his last two fights. If he doesn't, I think it's a great one for Fili. Honestly, if Yussuf goes back to his more passive counterpunching style, Fili's jab, his kicks, his ability to build over the course of a fight, he's going to have a field day. But I think there's a reason that we haven't seen that Yussuf in these last two performances. And looking at Andre Fili, being able to make a read, what he's good at, just seeing his reach on paper is probably enough to persuade Yussuf to come in and fight aggressively again. So I'm going to take Yussuf there. Okay. Great matchup, man. I tend to agree with you. Hardest one to pick on the card. Okay. Well, that's pretty much all that we have time to cover for UFC 246. Pretty good one. I mean, I don't know. Maybe doesn't light the fire in my loins the way I would want it to, but there's enough here to keep me satisfied. It doesn't take all that much right after the kind of long drought that we've had now. So I'm fine with it. And boy, we've got another card coming up next week. Let's see, Curtis Blades versus Junior Dos Santos. Rafael Dos Anjos versus Michael Chiesa. Some other shit. Yeah, that'll be fine. So thank you all for listening to this week's edition of Heavy Hands. Feels like the first proper episode of 2020. Both of us in our right minds once again. Before we go, Phil, do you want to plug anything?
Just the preview. So we're going to be breaking down Cerrone McGregor, and I think mercifully we might not have to do Home Pennington, but let's see.
Good for you. Although I do kind of want to read you and David's breakdown of that one. All right, so you'll find that on bloodyelbow.com. As for me, I may have an article coming out this week, but for now, all I know about for sure is a video that should be going up any moment now on the... Shoot, is it on the Bloody Elbow Presents or the MMANation.com YouTube channel? Not 100% sure, but make sure you check that one out. It's going to be me sort of lambasting the cynicism behind the matchup in the main event. Why it's being made, how it is transparently a fight created to give Conor McGregor a win, and how you shouldn't listen to Dana White when he tries to make you feel guilty for saying as much. So that's it for this week's edition of Heavy Hands. Oh, find us on social media, of course. Twitter is where we usually hang out. You can find Phil on there at Evil Greg Jackson and myself at Boxing Bush with a B-U-S-C-H. Make sure you check us out on Patreon. I'm going to get some shit out to you guys this month. Not 100% sure what yet, but going to start putting some content up on there. So make sure you check out the Heavy Hands Patreon. $3 a month is all it takes to get access to all of our bonus shiz. And until next week, thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you then. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.